the day that we have learned of the passing of Margaret Thatcher at the age of 87. We're discussing her legacy. With us to talk about it, Alison SMALE, executive editor of the International Herald Tribune; Stephen JESSEL, former BBC correspondent; also with us, Stephen CLARKE, a journalist and author of 1,000 Years of Annoying the French. With us as well is Jean-Claude SERGEANT, French historian, and joining us from London, Jonathan ISABY, editor of conservativehome.com. We're also joined in London by Tony Benn, former Labour MP and a cabinet minister under the predecessor of Margaret Thatcher, the predecessor of Margaret Thatcher, James Callaghan. Mr. Benn, thank you for joining us for this short while. When the general election happens in 1979, did you have the feeling that Britain was about to change so much?
Well, Mrs. Thatcher was a very strong candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party. Many people thought she wouldn't win, but she did. And her strength lay in the fact that she was always known to believe what she said and to say what she believed and to do what she said she'd do if she had the chance. And this gave her a certain popularity with the public who felt they had voted for her. And she used that power to attack the sources of opposition to her, namely the trade union movement, the miners, local government, and so on. And in the end, at the end of the miners' strike, the Conservatives threw out Mrs. Thatcher, and the miners re-elected Arthur Scargill as the president of the National Union of Mine Workers.
The mines, though, were never the same in Britain, nor in France. When you look back on it, what would you say on the European scene was her enduring legacy?
Well, I think Mrs. Thatcher's natural caution about Europe was because she didn't want to be governed by Brussels. She wanted to be governed by people we elected, and she thought that this was really taking over Britain and making it into a European colony. And therefore she was very cautious. And that caution is still quite strongly felt in Britain because of the European Union and the problems over financing Greece and Italy and so on. And so I think she still has an influence on Europe. On other matters, I think she's really been discredited by events.
Discredited by events, but the British Prime Minister today said that she's the greatest peacetime Prime Minister Britain has had in this past century.
Well, that's part of the tributes that are being paid. We're being told every 5 minutes what a wonderful Prime Minister she was. And I think if you actually ask people in the street, that's not how they would see it. They would look back on the miners' strike and the attack upon the trade unions and the poll tax. And so I think you mustn't confuse funeral tributes with economic and political reality.
All right, Tony Benn, thanks for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Let me get your reaction, Stephen JESSEL, to hearing those words.
Well, I agree to a certain extent with Mr. Benn. On Europe, I actually was in the room when she gave her infamous Bruges speech, in which she laid in to the European Union. There's no other way of putting it. We have not rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain to see them reimposed by a Brussels bureaucracy, or words to that effect. And I used to see after every summit, and I used to interview her after every summit, and it made no difference what question you asked her, because she always gave exactly the same reply, which was the one that she'd prepared and the one that she wanted. She didn't like Europe. She was the despair of some of her officials, I can tell you that. Rooted perhaps in her background. She came from a very small town in central England. Her father was an alderman, a local worthy, and a grocer and so forth. I mean, she was very much a product of that particular background. She didn't really have any international dimension to her.
The same year that Margaret Thatcher takes office, she says in those days it was called the European Community, a European Community Summit in Dublin, "We are simply asking to have our own money back." At a summit in 1984, well, she would get it, the UK earning a rebate on its dues. Europe, a favourite target of hers throughout her tenure.
The President of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no.
And by the way, the man who was French president when she took office, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, says Thatcher's very free market turn on economic policy was, quote, probably a little at the root of the current crisis.
She was not interested in the structure of the system, not very much in the future of the system. She was interested in the position of Britain in Europe, and she protected it as best as she could.
Can it be said that, to a certain degree, Thatcher contributed to Giscard d'Estaing's demise, since she railroaded over him at that summit in.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but certainly she made her mark. I mean, few are the European politicians who would have forgotten her. And so, as David Cameron we saw saying, you know, if you stand in Brussels today, it's her rebate that you're still sort of enjoying and defending.
Is it unfair when Giscard says that her policies are probably a little at the root of the current crisis?
I think that's a very long discussion. I mean, I think Stephen articulated quite well the sort of opposition to Thatcher and how you can say that maybe her privatization of nationalized state assets laid the seed for the sort of runaway financial markets and reckless behavior by bankers that we've seen. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to blame Margaret Thatcher for that, but certainly she did unleash a different kind of economic activity in Britain, and you can say that there's a line between that and what we see today. But I think on Europe, what's interesting is that she, on the one hand, had a very interesting strategic view of all of Europe and wanted to see it united, and I do think was partly responsible for the end of communism. And on the other hand, she absolutely did not want Britain to be touched by Europe in some way. And it's actually rather a contradictory point of view.
Jean-Claude SERGEANT.
I think it's important to point out the fact that she was very much in favor of the single market.
Yes.
And the single market concept was something which was introduced by the Brits, and particularly by Mrs. Thatcher during those years. And the key point of all the negotiation was, of course, the Luxembourg Agreement of 1994, when, in fact, the various European partners were fed up with Mrs. Thatcher's repeated claim that she wanted the money back, and said, OK, we're going to have the money back. And the rebate is still there. And every time there is a European Council meeting, of course, they're still debating the extent and the legitimacy of this famous debate introduced by Mrs. Thatcher and achieved by Mrs. Thatcher in 1984.
So if today she was in the Conservative Party, would she be closer to the UKIP Eurosceptic portion, or would she be more towards, the center of the party?
Well, very much more UKIP-sided than anything else, basically.
Stephen Jessup, when you covered Brussels at the time, did you sense what Alison was describing, this sort of this mixed message?
Yes, she was interested in the single market because the British have always regarded the European Union community, whatever you like to call it, as a mercantile thing. It's where you buy and sell things. There is no of as little political dimension as possible, and it all has to be subordinate to the free movement of goods, labour, so forth and so forth. I was there when Delors had these remarkable ideas. I mean, the rhetoric that was coming out of Brussels in those days was quite extraordinary, and it was a rather exhilarating time in some respects, but it clearly wasn't to Mrs. Thatcher's liking whatsoever. She saw the European Union as a place to do business, and that was the beginning and pretty much the end of it.
When you think a few years later, Tony Blair would actually promise a referendum on the euro. It was still, at the time, there were a lot of people who were quite Europhile, even within Thatcher's party.
Yeah, but I think what Margaret Thatcher did was she seemed to want to control the UK and not want Europe to control it. But in fact, what she did was cripple the state. So in fact, the British state now can't control its own economy. It's all down to money. This is where you could say she's at the root of the current crisis, because she freed things up so much that now, Westminster can't control what's happening at Canary Wharf 3 miles down the river, because this whole financial world is just doing its own thing. And they're trying to rein it back in now. They've had to renationalize some banks and things like that, because it went so far. So yes, she was interested in the single market as a place to do business, but in fact, I think she just opened up Britain and ironically, her stance has let Europe take over Britain. Because as I was saying before, thanks to globalization now, the UK's utilities are mainly controlled by foreign companies. And so, maybe that's good for the country, I don't know, but it's ironic that what she did actually let in the people she didn't want to let in, the French,
Well, not just the French, but the Japanese and the Americans.
And also,
primarily.
Everyone except the British.
Everyone except the British. Capital has gone global and governments have remained national.
Yeah, but it's funny that you say that, Stephen, because the feeling on this side of the channel is that all the money from the continent has gone over to London.
All the money may be stored over there, but doesn't belong to Britain in any way. I mean, the French love to cover up their globalization by blaming it on other people, but if you travel around the world, you see French brands absolutely everywhere in the world. Don't worry about that. You don't see so many British brands, but but the thing that gets me is, I live in France, so wholly, completely in favour of an open European Union. But whenever I go back, what amuses me is that the British don't even realise that everything's been sold off. They say they get their electricity from EDF, but you say, what does EDF mean? They don't know. You have to, if you go onto edf.co.uk website, it takes you a long time to find out it's a French company. Where she opened the floodgates and she let Britain get sold off, and she's provided jobs, but that money that's in London doesn't belong to London, and David Cameron doesn't know how to manage it all. He's at the mercy. If the banks all leave, Britain hasn't got an economy.
It's not his to manage either.
I know exactly. So he has no control whatsoever over the British economy. Ultimately, if they decide to all go to Luxembourg one day, London will be empty. What will the British people do?
Jonathan ISABY, has Britain been sold off because of Thatcher's policies?
Margaret Thatcher believed in privatisation and opening up markets to the wider world, and that's obviously a good thing. One of the first things that she did in government was to abolish exchange controls. But prior to her election, the government limited how much money a British person could take in and out of the country. Incredibly draconian measure. She opened up those markets and she privatised the industries so that there was competition, so that prices could be driven down, so there was more consumer choice, all of which are good things, and all of which are things that remain to this day, and which indeed her political opponents have not reversed.
You can't reverse. It's gone too far. You can't. This is what we were talking earlier about student grants. It's true. Tony Blair or the Labour Party took away student grants and made students pay, but that's just because the state had been so bankrupted by what had gone before. They had no choice. It's stripping out. In France, people complain about the economy and say it's la crise, But France still has so much social protection, so much the government can control education and the economy, so much, and keep it. It may not be doing fantastically, but keep it it's like an oil tanker. They keep the sort of oil tanker trundling on. We don't know how much oil's in it and where it's going exactly, but it trundles on. In the UK, you just can't do that. Government can decide practically nothing anymore. It's very sad, but it's true. They can't decide how much their students are going to pay. For
at the same time, the government decided to some extent to nationalize some of the banking establishments, particularly.
Otherwise, everyone would have lost their money.
85% of the leading banks, of course, have been nationalized by Gordon Brown. In Scotland.
Yeah, but otherwise, these banks, they were supposedly controlling they were supposedly doing free, business. Had been opened up to the public. Everyone had shares. Wonderful. They went bankrupt. The state had to bail them out. Yes. What kind of success is that?
Yes, but coming back to the problem of popularity, we may point out the fact that Mrs. Thatcher had hardly ever been very popular, including after the Falklands War.
But she got re-elected twice.
Yeah, of course, but she had a majority, but never above 50%. And in 1983, slightly before the election campaign for the election of 1993, popularity rating was 52%.
Well, before the invasion of the Falklands, her popularity rating was very low.
Of course.
The Argentines did her a great favour.
No, they didn't. They just, yes.
Yes, and by the time she left in 1990, popularity rate was about something like 25-30%. So she never was the sort of popular, iconic
I think
politician.
too, you have to look at the political context. The opposition was in such a terrible condition in Britain. It was divided. There was a new party that arose and then vanished again. There were some awful leaders. A better leader might perhaps have replaced...
Not awful, no, we can't say Neil Kinnock was an awful leader. He was a charismatic leader. I mean, and got people away with him.
And he narrowly lost.
He lost, of course.
narrowly.
Well, he lost.
But he lost.
He lost basically because of his defence policy, if you remember, in 1983. There's no doubt. And well, 83, but Michael's foot lost for the defence policy.
That was the one I was thinking of.
83 was
Final question for you, Stephen Jessel. Her downfall came from a rift within her own party.
Yes.
And
well, there were two reasons. First of all, the poll tax was a disaster, and she couldn't see it or wouldn't see it, but there were riots in the centre of London. The Scots still hate her. There won't be many tears shed in Scotland tonight, I suspect. And Geoffrey Howe, her then foreign minister, although you would never have guessed it from the way she treated him, he was deeply critical of her European policy. And it just got to the point where, people said, well, this can't go on. And a successful ministers trooped up to 10 Downing Street and said, I'm sorry, Margaret, you're going to have to go.
Well, in the U.S., they've named an airport in Washington outside after Ronald Reagan. Is there going to be? How does it work in Britain when a leader like that does?
She was. I'll say this. I knew her for 40 years. She had guts. She had guts in spades. She was a very brave and determined lady. Whether that was in the right direction, I don't know. We haven't mentioned the bombing of the Grand Hotel in Brighton, where the IRA came with an ace of killing her. The Falklands we've touched on, but it took real guts actually to charter a cruise liner and send off your troops to the other side of the world. And I think Tony Benn was right in saying that, that was what actually appealed to people. 13 years is a long time. People got bored with her. She was stabbed in the back by many of her supporters. And all good things and indeed all bad things come to an end.
All right, what she did have, and we all can agree with consensus here, is that she did have leadership qualities. Stephen Jessel, I want to thank you. I want to thank Jean-Claude SERGEANT, Stephen Clarke, Alison SMALE. I also want to thank Jonathan ISABY for joining us from London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 today.